That Tuesday morning when I saw Charlotte's LinkedIn post. God, I'll never forget the feeling of my stomach just dropping through the floor. There I was, sitting in my kitchen with my coffee getting cold, scrolling through social media like any other day. And then boom, major win today. Presented our proposal to Morrison Industries and landed the account. Solo victory feels amazing. Solo victory. Those two words hit me like a slap across the face because I absolutely knew, that nothing about that presentation had been solo. Charlotte had taken 3 weeks of my life, my ideas, my sleepless nights, and she'd just erased me. Completely. Like I'd never existed. The woman I'd trusted, the woman I'd called my partner, had stolen my work and was celebrating it publicly while I sat there feeling like the biggest fool in the world. My hands were literally shaking as I screenshot that post, because some part of me knew I'd need proof that this nightmare was actually happening. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't even process it at first. And what came after that post? Jesus, what came after was even worse. Because that's when I discovered that everyone I worked with, everyone I thought respected me, was going to pretend like nothing had happened. Like Charlotte's lies were more comfortable than my truth. But here's what I learned from the whole damn thing, and why I'm telling you this story now. I remember the day Charlotte first called me her right-hand person like it was yesterday. We were standing by the coffee machine, steam rising from our mugs, and she had this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. For 8 months, we worked side by side on the Henderson account, burning the midnight oil, sharing takeout containers, and celebrating small victories with high fives that felt genuine. Trust wasn't something I gave easily, but Charlotte had earned it through countless late nights where she'd ask for my opinion and actually listen. When she said we were a team, I believed her completely. The professional environment we'd built together felt solid, unshakable, like we were two pieces of the same puzzle that had finally found their perfect fit. Looking back now, I can see how carefully she cultivated that sense of loyalty between us. She'd send me texts on weekends asking about my thoughts on client strategies, not because she needed my input right then, but because it made me feel valued and essential. Charlotte had this gift for making you feel like your ideas mattered, like you were contributing to something bigger than yourself. She'd lean back in her chair during our brainstorming sessions, nod thoughtfully at my suggestions, and say things like, "That's exactly what we needed," or "You always see the angles I miss." The frustration I'd felt in previous jobs, where my contributions went unnoticed, seemed like a thing of the past. I thought I'd finally found someone who understood my worth and wasn't threatened by my capabilities. But there's something about betrayal that makes you question everything you thought you knew. And what happened next would teach me that some partnerships exist only in your own mind. The request came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with Charlotte's trademark smile, and that conspiratorial tone she used when she wanted you to feel special. She needed my expertise for the big pitch to Morrison Industries, she said, the kind of account that could make or break careers in our department. The way she framed it made it sound like we were about to embark on the most important collaboration of our professional lives together. "Listen, Harper," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with that casual confidence that made everyone want to be around her. "I know you've been through this kind of presentation before, and honestly, I need someone with your experience to help me nail this thing." The word help should have been my first red flag, but I was too caught up in the excitement of being chosen, of being needed. She pulled out her notebook, already filled with preliminary ideas, and started talking about timelines and strategies like we were co-conspirators planning the perfect heist. I felt that familiar rush of professional pride, the same feeling I'd had when I landed my first big client years ago. The environment around us buzzed with the energy of possibility, and I was ready to pour everything I had into making this presentation flawless. The next 3 weeks became a blur of 18-hour days and caffeine-fueled strategy sessions. I restructured her entire approach, turning a basic product overview into a compelling narrative about transformation and growth that spoke directly to Morrison Industries' recent expansion goals. Charlotte would sit beside me as I worked, occasionally offering encouragement or asking clarifying questions, but mostly just watching as I crafted slide after slide of polished content. She had this way of making you feel like your hard work was a gift you were giving to the team, rather than labor that deserved recognition. I rewrote her opening 3 times until it had the perfect balance of confidence and humility. I created financial projections that told a story of partnership and mutual success. Every evening, as I finally packed up to leave, Charlotte would pat my shoulder and say something like, "We're going to kill this thing." And that word, "we," felt like a promise. The night before the presentation, I stayed until nearly midnight making final adjustments to the slides, double-checking every statistic, and rehearsing the flow of arguments to make sure they built naturally from one point to the next. Charlotte had left hours earlier, claiming she needed to get some sleep before the big day, but not before stopping by my desk to thank me for my incredible support. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction as I saved the final version of our presentation, knowing that we'd created something truly exceptional together. The professional environment felt electric with anticipation, and I went home that night with the kind of tired contentment that comes from knowing you've given your absolute best to something that matters. What I didn't realize was that I'd just handed over the keys to my own professional kingdom. The morning of the presentation, I arrived early to set up the conference room, testing the projector, arranging materials, and even brewing a fresh pot of that expensive coffee Charlotte preferred for important meetings. I wanted everything to be perfect for our big moment. As the Morrison Industries team filed in, I felt that familiar pre-presentation nervousness mixed with excitement, the kind of anticipation that comes from knowing you're about to share something you're genuinely proud of. Charlotte walked in wearing her power suit, looking every inch the confident executive, and gave me a small nod that I interpreted as acknowledgement of our partnership. But as she began to speak, introducing the presentation with words and phrases I'd written, something cold settled in my stomach. She spoke about her research, her insights, her strategic approach, as if I never existed at all. The trust I'd built in our collaboration crumbled with each sentence that erased my contribution from the narrative. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with my usual cup of coffee, scrolling through LinkedIn before heading to work, still trying to process what had happened during the presentation. Part of me wanted to believe it was just nerves, that Charlotte had simply gotten caught up in the moment and forgotten to acknowledge my contributions. I'd been telling myself that we'd talk about it later, that she'd pull me aside and apologize for the oversight. Trust doesn't die easily when you've invested so much of yourself in believing someone has your back. But then I saw her post, and everything I thought I knew about our partnership shattered like glass hitting concrete. Major win today. Presented our proposal to Morrison Industries and landed the account. Solo victory feels amazing. The casual betrayal of those words hit me harder than anything she'd done in that conference room. I stared at my phone screen, reading and rereading those words until they burned themselves into my memory. Solo victory. As if 3 weeks of my life, my ideas, my sleepless nights, and my expertise had never existed. The professional environment that I thought we built together was revealed as nothing more than a convenient fiction she'd maintained, while I did the heavy lifting. I felt my hands start to shake as the full weight of her deception hit me. She hadn't just forgotten to mention me in the heat of the moment. She had deliberately crafted a narrative that erased me completely. The frustration I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced before. A deep, burning anger mixed with a crushing sense of disappointment in my own judgment. How could I have been so blind to what was really happening? The comments started rolling in within minutes, each one twisting the knife deeper into my professional pride. "Knew you could do it all by yourself," wrote Jake from marketing, and I watched in horror as Charlotte not only liked his comment, but replied with a laughing emoji. "And thanks, babe. Sometimes you just have to trust your instincts." The word babe made my skin crawl. This casual, flirtatious tone that suggested their relationship went beyond professional courtesy. I'd seen them talking by the water cooler, heads bent close together, but I'd never thought much of it. Now I wondered how many of my ideas Charlotte had shared with Jake during their little chats. How many times she'd tested my strategies on him before presenting them as her own inspiration. But what really destroyed me was the photo she posted an hour later. There we were, both of us standing in front of the Morrison Industries logo during the presentation. But the way she'd cropped and filtered it made me look like background scenery. I was there, technically visible, but blurred and pushed to the edge of the frame while she stood center stage, pointing at the slide that contained my financial projections. The caption read, "My moment to shine. So grateful for this opportunity to showcase my strategic thinking." My strategic thinking. The words I'd written, the research I'd compiled, the late nights I'd spent perfecting every detail, all of it repackaged as her personal triumph. The confidence I'd built up over months of believing I was valued, that my contributions mattered, evaporated like steam from that coffee cup I was still clutching. I screenshot the post before I could stop myself, some instinct telling me I'd need evidence of this betrayal later. The learning process was brutal and immediate. I was discovering just how naive I'd been about office politics and the way some people could smile to your face while planning to stab you in the back. Charlotte had played me perfectly, making me feel essential while positioning herself to take all the credit. She'd even managed to make me complicit in my own erasure by framing our collaboration as support rather than partnership. Every encouraging word, every grateful smile, every time she'd made me feel valued, it had all been theater designed to keep me working while she prepared to step into the spotlight alone. As I sat there staring at that post, I realized that everyone in our office would see it. Our colleagues, our supervisors, potential clients who followed Charlotte on social media. They would all absorb this version of events where she was the brilliant strategist who single-handedly won over Morrison Industries. The professional environment I'd worked so hard to establish myself in would remember this moment as Charlotte's triumph, not as the collaboration it actually was. I felt invisible, erased, like I'd never existed at all. The loyalty I'd given her, the trust I'd placed in our partnership, the genuine excitement I'd felt about our shared success, none of it had been real for her. I was just a convenient resource she'd used and discarded. The worst part was realizing how carefully orchestrated this whole thing had been. Charlotte hadn't just failed to credit me in a moment of excitement. She'd planned this. She'd known from the beginning that she intended to take full credit, and every conversation we'd had, every late night we'd spent working together, had been part of her strategy to extract my ideas while maintaining plausible deniability. The way she'd positioned herself as the presenter, the way she'd encouraged me to focus on the background work, the way she'd made me feel like we were partners, while actually treating me like her unpaid ghostwriter. It had all been calculated. And what hurt most was that I'd been so eager to believe in our professional relationship that I'd made myself the perfect victim. But this betrayal, as devastating as it felt in that moment, was just the beginning of a much deeper deception that would soon involve our entire team. Walking into the office that Monday morning felt like entering a different universe, one where the rules I thought I understood no longer applied. I kept expecting someone to approach me, to acknowledge what had happened, to at least ask how I felt about being completely erased from the Morrison Industries success story. The professional environment that had once felt collaborative and supportive now seemed charged with an uncomfortable tension that no one wanted to address directly. I'd spent the weekend convincing myself that my colleagues would see through Charlotte's deception, that someone would speak up about the obvious injustice of what had transpired. Instead, I was met with a silence so complete and deliberate that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The trust I'd placed in my teammates to recognize fairness and stand up for what was right dissolved faster than sugar in hot coffee. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came when I passed Riley in the hallway near the copy machine. We'd always had this easy rapport, sharing complaints about difficult clients and celebrating each other's wins with genuine enthusiasm. But when our eyes met that morning, she quickly looked away, suddenly becoming very interested in the stack of papers in her hands. The avoidance was so obvious, so uncomfortable that I actually stopped walking and turned to watch her hurry away. It wasn't just awkwardness. It was the kind of deliberate evasion you see when people know something is wrong but don't want to get involved. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish and exposed, wondering if everyone already knew what had happened and had collectively decided that acknowledging it would be too messy, too complicated for the smooth operation of our department. By Tuesday, the pattern was unmistakable. Conversations would halt when I entered the break room, replaced by forced smiles and overly cheerful comments about the weather or weekend plans. Ethan, who used to stop by my desk every morning to chat about his kids' soccer games, now took a different route to his office that avoided my corner entirely. The loyalty I thought existed among our team members revealed itself as nothing more than professional convenience, present when it cost nothing, absent when it might require actual courage. Even Sarah, who I'd helped prepare for her own client presentation just 2 months earlier, couldn't meet my eyes during our Thursday team meeting. The frustration I felt wasn't just about Charlotte's betrayal anymore. It was about discovering that I worked in an environment where witnessing injustice was apparently less important than maintaining the status quo. What made the silence even more painful was knowing that everyone had seen Charlotte's LinkedIn post. Our entire department followed each other on social media, sharing celebrations and supporting each other's professional milestones, at least. That's what I'd believed was happening. But now I realized that this network of mutual support was actually a surveillance system where everyone monitored everyone else's success and carefully calculated their responses based on office politics rather than genuine friendship. When Charlotte posted her follow-up photos from the Morrison Industries celebration dinner, a dinner I wasn't invited to despite having created half the content that secured the deal, the comments from our colleagues were enthusiastic and congratulatory. Not one person mentioned my absence or questioned the narrative she'd constructed. The learning process was brutal. I was discovering that professional environments often reward those who take credit, while punishing those who expect fairness. The most devastating moment came during our Friday afternoon department meeting when our supervisor, Marcus, publicly congratulated Charlotte on her exceptional solo performance with Morrison Industries. He talked about her innovative approach and strategic thinking while I sat 3 feet away, invisible as wallpaper. I kept waiting for him to acknowledge my contribution, for someone to correct the record, but the words never came. Instead, I watched my colleagues nod and smile, participating in the collective fiction that Charlotte had accomplished this feat entirely through her own efforts. The betrayal wasn't just Charlotte's anymore. It belonged to everyone in that room who chose silence over truth. Marcus announced that Charlotte would be taking the lead on our next major client pitch, citing her proven ability to deliver results independently. The irony was suffocating. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room, straightening papers and pretending to review my notes while everyone else filtered out. I was hoping someone would stay behind, would finally break the wall of silence that had surrounded this situation for a week. But one by one, they all left, until I was alone with the whiteboard still covered in Charlotte's handwriting. Ideas and strategies that were actually mine, now officially attributed to her in front of our entire leadership team. The professional environment I'd trusted to operate on principles of fairness and merit had revealed itself as something much darker, a place where truth was negotiable and loyalty flowed only upward to those with power. I sat there in that empty conference room, surrounded by the echoes of congratulations that should have been mine, and realized that the real betrayal wasn't what Charlotte had done to me. It was what everyone else had chosen not to do. The silence wasn't passive ignorance. It was active complicity. My colleagues weren't just avoiding an uncomfortable situation. They were participating in the rewriting of history, allowing Charlotte's version of events to become the official record, because challenging it would require them to take a stand. The confidence I'd built in this workplace, the sense of belonging I'd cultivated over months of collaborative work, crumbled as I understood that I was completely alone in this fight. But what I didn't know yet was that this conspiracy of silence was just the beginning. And soon I would face an even more direct confrontation that would force me to choose between accepting this injustice and fighting back, even if it meant risking everything I'd worked to build in this company. By the following Wednesday, I'd reached my breaking point. The frustration had been building like pressure in a steam kettle, and I knew that if I didn't address this situation directly, I'd either explode or implode. Neither option seemed particularly professional. I'd spent sleepless nights rehearsing what I would say to Charlotte, crafting arguments that were logical and measured, hoping to appeal to whatever sense of fairness might still exist beneath her polished exterior. The trust between us was already shattered, but I still believed that confronting her directly might lead to some acknowledgement of what had happened, maybe even a correction of the record. Looking back, I realized how naive that hope was, but at the time, it felt like my only path forward. The professional environment had become so toxic for me that I couldn't concentrate on my work, couldn't participate in meetings without feeling like a ghost haunting my own career. I found Charlotte in her office that afternoon, typing away at her computer with the same focused intensity she'd always brought to her work. For a moment, watching her through the glass partition, I almost lost my nerve. She looked so composed, so confident, completely untroubled by the deception she'd orchestrated. When I knocked on her doorframe, she looked up with that familiar smile that had once made me feel valued and welcomed. Now it just looked calculated, like she was already planning her response to whatever I might say. "Harper, come in, come in." I was just reviewing the follow-up materials for Morrison Industries. Amazing how well that whole thing went, right? The casual way she referenced that whole thing, as if it had nothing to do with me, set my teeth on edge before I'd even sat down. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," I said, settling into the chair across from her desk and trying to keep my voice steady. The loyalty I'd once felt toward her had transformed into something harder, more determined. I wasn't here to attack her or demand an apology. I was here to reclaim my professional dignity. "Charlotte, I feel like there's been some confusion about my role in the Morrison Industries project. I put a significant amount of work into that presentation, and I'm concerned that my contributions aren't being properly recognized. I'd practiced this opening dozens of times, crafting it to be assertive without being confrontational, clear without being accusatory. But the moment the words left my mouth, I could see Charlotte's expression shift into something I'd never seen before. Cold, dismissive, almost predatory. She leaned back in her chair, that warm smile fading into something that barely qualified as polite interest. "Harper, I think you might be overestimating your involvement in that project. Yes, you provided some support and feedback, which I appreciated, but the strategic vision, the client research, the presentation structure, that was all my work." The way she said support made it sound like I'd brought her coffee and made copies, not spent 3 weeks restructuring her entire approach. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I actually questioned my own memory. But then she continued, and any doubt I had about her intentions evaporated. "I understand that you might feel invested because you helped out, but I think it's important for you to understand the difference between supporting a colleague and actually leading a project." The disappointment I felt in that moment was deeper than anything Charlotte had done before. This wasn't just about credit or recognition anymore. She was actively trying to rewrite history, to convince me that my own memory of events was wrong. "Charlotte, I completely restructured your approach to that presentation. I wrote the financial projections, created the timeline, developed the strategic framework you presented. That wasn't support, that was collaboration, and I think you know that." My voice was getting stronger as I spoke, fed by the righteous anger of someone who refuses to accept an obvious lie. But instead of acknowledging any truth in what I was saying, Charlotte's expression hardened into something I could only describe as contempt. "Harper, I think you need to step back and consider how this sounds. You're essentially claiming that I couldn't have succeeded without you, which honestly feels a bit presumptuous." She stood up and moved to the window, her back to me, as if my presence had become distasteful. "The Morrison Industries account was my responsibility from day one. I brought you in for some assistance because I value collaboration. But I'm starting to think that was a mistake if it's led to this kind of confusion about roles and responsibilities." The way she was spinning the narrative was masterful and infuriating, turning my legitimate concerns about credit into evidence of my own delusions of grandeur. The learning process was harsh and immediate. I was discovering that some people could look you in the eye and lie so completely that they almost made you doubt reality itself. When she turned back to face me, her expression had shifted into something that resembled pity, which somehow felt worse than anger. "Look, Harper, I understand that you want to feel important, that you want to be seen as a key contributor. But sometimes the best way to support the team is to do good work behind the scenes without needing constant recognition for it. You should be proud that you were part of a successful project, even if your role was more foundational." The word foundational was delivered with just enough condescension to make it clear she meant insignificant. I sat there listening to her rewrite 3 weeks of my life, watching her transform my leadership into her charity, my expertise into her patience with a needy subordinate. The betrayal was complete now, not just in action but in her willingness to deny reality to my face. I left her office that day knowing that any hope of resolving this situation through direct conversation was dead. But what I didn't anticipate was how quickly Charlotte would move to protect herself from any future challenges to her narrative. Within a week, I found myself being gradually excluded from projects, meetings, and decisions that had once been routine parts of my job. The professional environment that had already felt hostile became actively dangerous to my career. And I realized that confronting Charlotte hadn't just failed to solve the problem. It had marked me as a threat that needed to be neutralized. The real consequences of speaking truth to power were just beginning to unfold. The months that followed were the most difficult of my professional life, but they were also the most educational. Sitting in my apartment on quiet Sunday mornings, coffee growing cold as I stared out the window, I began to understand that what had happened with Charlotte wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a masterclass in workplace manipulation that I'd been too trusting to recognize while it was happening. The frustration I'd felt was slowly transforming into something more valuable. Hard-won wisdom about how power operates in professional environments and how easy it is to become complicit in your own exploitation when you mistake strategic flattery for genuine appreciation. I started keeping a journal during this period, not for therapeutic reasons, but because I realized I needed to document the patterns I was finally beginning to see clearly. The first and most painful lesson was about documentation. Charlotte had been brilliant in how she'd structured our collaboration. Everything important happened in verbal conversations, casual hallway chats, and informal brainstorming sessions that left no paper trail. When I tried to piece together evidence of my contributions to the Morrison Industries project, I realized with growing horror that I had almost nothing concrete to show for 3 weeks of intensive work. The emails between us were vague and friendly, focusing on logistics rather than content ownership. The shared documents showed revision histories, but not the hours of conversation where I'd walked her through my strategic thinking. Trust, I learned, isn't just about believing someone will treat you fairly. It's about creating systems and processes that make fairness verifiable and unfairness actionable. I began to replay every collaboration I'd ever been part of, looking for the warning signs I'd missed with Charlotte. The pattern was devastatingly clear once I knew what to look for. She'd always positioned herself as the client-facing representative while encouraging me to focus on the analytical and creative work behind the scenes. She'd praised my insights while carefully controlling how and when those insights were shared with others. She'd made me feel essential to the process, while ensuring that my essentialness was invisible to everyone who mattered for my career advancement. The loyalty I'd felt toward her had been weaponized against me, turning my dedication into a tool for my own professional diminishment. The learning process was brutal but necessary. I was finally understanding how collaboration could be used as camouflage for exploitation. But perhaps the most important realization was about my own role in what had happened. Not in terms of deserving the betrayal, that was entirely on Charlotte, but in terms of the choices I'd made that left me vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. I'd been so hungry for professional validation, so eager to be seen as a team player, that I'd consistently undervalued my own contributions and overestimated the importance of being liked. The confidence I'd thought I possessed was actually a deep insecurity disguised as generosity. I'd given away credit, downplayed my expertise, and deflected recognition because I'd been taught that self-promotion was unseemly, and that good work would inevitably be rewarded. The professional environment had taught me that being humble and supportive was virtuous, but it had failed to teach me that these virtues could be exploited by people who didn't share them. The financial impact of Charlotte's betrayal became clear as annual review season approached. The Morrison Industries' success was prominently featured in her performance evaluation, leading to a promotion and a significant salary increase. Meanwhile, my own review was notably sparse, lacking the kind of major wins that drive career advancement in our field. I watched Charlotte move into a corner office while I remained in the same cubicle, doing increasingly peripheral work under increasingly scrutinized conditions. The economic consequences of being erased from a major project weren't abstract. They translated directly into lost opportunities, missed promotions, and a growing gap between where my career should have been and where it actually was. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated theft of my professional future. During this period of reflection, I also began to understand the broader systemic issues that had enabled Charlotte's behavior. Our workplace culture celebrated individual achievement while paying lip service to collaboration, creating an environment where taking credit for others' work was not just possible but rewarded. The professional environment favored those who were skilled at managing up and networking over those who were skilled at actually doing the work. Performance reviews focused on visible achievements rather than collaborative contributions, essentially incentivizing the kind of credit stealing that Charlotte had perfected. I realized that I hadn't just been betrayed by one person. I'd been failed by an entire system that was designed to reward people like Charlotte, while exploiting people like me. The most difficult part of this learning process was accepting that my faith in fairness and meritocracy had been naive. I believed that good work would speak for itself, that honest collaboration would be recognized and rewarded, that basic professional ethics were universally shared values. The disappointment of discovering how wrong I'd been was almost more devastating than Charlotte's original betrayal. But within that disappointment was the seed of something more powerful, a determination to never again allow my professional success to depend on other people's integrity or goodwill. I began to plan my next steps carefully, understanding that the only way to protect myself from future Charlottes was to fundamentally change how I approached collaboration, credit, and career advancement. The betrayal had been painful, but the education it provided would prove invaluable as I prepared to rebuild my professional life on a foundation of hard-earned wisdom rather than misplaced trust. The first sign that things might change came from the most unexpected source, Victoria from the accounting department. We'd barely spoken beyond polite greetings in the elevator, that she approached me one Tuesday afternoon as I was eating lunch alone in the company cafeteria. That sad meal of leftover pasta that had become my routine since Charlotte's systematic exclusion campaign had made the break room uncomfortable territory. Victoria slid into the seat across from me without invitation, her expression serious and determined. "Harper, I need to tell you something about what happened with Morrison Industries. I've been watching what's going on, and it's not right." The confidence in her voice surprised me. Here was someone willing to acknowledge what everyone else had chosen to ignore. Her first words were like oxygen to someone who'd been drowning in a sea of willful blindness. I was in the copy room when Charlotte was on the phone with Jake about the presentation. Victoria continued, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. She was laughing about how you'd done all the heavy lifting and how she just had to package it properly for the audience. She used those exact words, heavy lifting, like you were her personal research assistant or something. The betrayal I felt hearing this was different from everything that had come before, not because Charlotte's callousness surprised me anymore, but because it confirmed that her deception had been even more calculated than I'd realized. She hadn't just stolen credit. She'd actively mocked my contributions while plotting her strategy. But more importantly, Victoria's willingness to share this information meant that at least one person in our office had been paying attention and found Charlotte's behavior as disturbing as I did. Over the following weeks, more colleagues began to emerge from their protective silence. Ethan stopped by my desk one morning, ostensibly to ask about a project deadline, that lingered to mention that he'd noticed how Charlotte's recent presentations bore a striking resemblance to work I'd shared in previous team meetings. Riley sent me a carefully worded email asking if I'd be interested in collaborating on a client proposal, making sure to include detailed documentation about roles and responsibilities. Even Marcus, our supervisor, began asking me more specific questions about my project contributions during our one-on-one meetings, as if he was trying to piece together a more accurate picture of what had really happened. The professional environment wasn't transforming overnight, but cracks were appearing in the wall of silence that had protected Charlotte's narrative. The real breakthrough came when I was invited to join a cross-departmental task force on client retention strategies. The invitation came directly from senior management, bypassing the usual departmental hierarchy that Charlotte had been using to control my visibility. During our first meeting, I found myself working with people who had no preconceived notions about my capabilities, no investment in Charlotte's version of events, and no reason to minimize my contributions to maintain office harmony. For the first time in months, I could speak freely about my ideas and experience without worrying about political repercussions. The trust I'd lost in my immediate work environment began to rebuild as I remembered what it felt like to be valued for my actual skills, rather than my willingness to remain invisible. The contrast between this new working environment and my previous situation with Charlotte was stark and illuminating. In the task force, ideas were attributed to their originators, collaboration meant shared credit, and disagreements were discussed openly, rather than being resolved through back-channel manipulation. When I presented a framework for client communication that drew on lessons learned from the Morrison Industries project, my colleagues asked thoughtful questions and built on my concepts, rather than trying to absorb them into their own portfolios. The learning process continued, but now it was about positive professional dynamics rather than defensive strategies. I began to understand what healthy workplace relationships actually looked like, and how different they were from the carefully orchestrated exploitation I'd mistaken for partnership. As my involvement in the task force expanded, so did my visibility within the broader company. Senior managers who had never known my name began requesting my input on strategic initiatives. My email signatures started including project leadership roles that reflected my actual contributions rather than the diminished positions Charlotte had tried to create for me. The confidence I'd lost during those months of gaslighting and exclusion slowly returned. But it was different now, more grounded, more realistic about workplace dynamics, and more protective of my own interests. I wasn't the same trusting person who had handed over 3 weeks of work without ensuring proper attribution, and I never would be again. The most satisfying moment came during a quarterly all-hands meeting when the CEO specifically mentioned the task force's innovative approach to client retention, citing several of the strategies I'd developed. As I listened to my ideas being recognized at the highest level of the company, I noticed Charlotte sitting 2 rows behind me, her face carefully composed but her hands clenched in her lap. She tried to erase me from the professional landscape, but here I was, being acknowledged by leadership for work that was undeniably, documentably mine. The triumph wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my professional identity and proving to myself that I could survive betrayal and emerge stronger. But the real test of my growth would come when I had to decide how to handle the inevitable encounter with Charlotte that this new visibility would create, and whether I could maintain my professional composure when faced with the person who had tried to destroy my career for her own advancement. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you felt that sick feeling in your stomach when you realized someone you trusted was taking credit for your work, I want you to know something important. You're not crazy, you're not oversensitive, and you're definitely not alone. The gaslighting that follows workplace betrayal is designed to make you question your own memory and minimize your own contributions. But your instincts are probably right. When someone systematically erases your involvement in a project while maintaining friendly relationships with you, that's not a misunderstanding or an oversight. It's calculated exploitation. The professional environment can be brutal for people who operate with integrity and assume others will do the same. But your willingness to trust and collaborate isn't a weakness, even when it's been weaponized against you. I've learned that workplace betrayal follows predictable patterns, and recognizing these patterns can help you protect yourself before the damage becomes irreversible. The betrayer usually starts by positioning themselves as your mentor or champion, making you feel specially chosen and valued for your unique contributions. They encourage you to focus on the substantive work while they handle the relationship management and client interactions. They praise your insights privately while ensuring your visibility remains limited to them alone. The trust you place in this arrangement feels natural and collaborative, but it's actually creating the perfect conditions for your eventual erasure. By the time you realize what's happening, they've already established themselves as the face of your shared work, leaving you with no clear way to reclaim credit without appearing petty or delusional. The frustration you feel when colleagues remain silent about obvious injustice is perhaps the most isolating part of this experience. You'll discover that most people would rather maintain comfortable relationships with successful manipulators than risk their own standing by defending someone who's been marginalized. The silence isn't personal, it's systemic. Your coworkers aren't necessarily bad people. They're just operating within a professional environment that rewards those who avoid conflict and punishes those who challenge established narratives. Understanding this doesn't make it hurt less, but it can help you focus your energy on documentation and strategic relationship building, rather than expecting others to validate your experience or fight your battles for you. The disappointment of discovering that hard work and talent aren't automatically rewarded can shake your fundamental beliefs about how the world operates. I spent months questioning whether I was actually as skilled as I'd believed, whether my contributions were as valuable as I'd thought, whether I deserved better treatment, or was just entitled and naive. This self-doubt is a normal response to betrayal, but it's also dangerous because it can paralyze you when you most need to take action. The learning process requires you to hold two truths simultaneously. Your worth isn't determined by other people's treatment of you, and you must become much more strategic about protecting and promoting your contributions if you want to succeed in environments where not everyone operates with integrity. The path forward isn't about becoming cynical or defensive, but about becoming smarter and more systematic in how you approach collaboration. Document everything, not because you don't trust your colleagues, but because memory is fallible and credit can become disputed, even in the most well-intentioned partnerships. Communicate your contributions clearly and regularly, not because you're seeking praise, but because visibility is a professional necessity in competitive environments. Build relationships across multiple departments and levels, not because networking is fun, but because having advocates who understand your capabilities can protect you when someone tries to minimize your role in shared successes. The confidence you lost through betrayal can be rebuilt, but it requires you to take active responsibility for your professional reputation, rather than assuming others will recognize and reward your contributions automatically. Most importantly, I want you to understand that surviving workplace betrayal isn't just about recovering from what happened. It's about emerging with wisdom that will serve you for the rest of your career. The people who betray colleagues rarely stop at one victim. They're usually building careers on a foundation of appropriated contributions and exploited relationships. By learning to recognize and respond to these dynamics, you're not just protecting yourself, you're developing the skills to mentor others who might find themselves in similar situations. The loyalty you once gave blindly can become a more valuable gift when it's offered strategically to people who've demonstrated they deserve it. Your voice matters, your contributions have value, and your professional worth isn't diminished by someone else's willingness to steal credit for your work. The betrayal you experienced was about their character, not your capabilities. The silence you encountered was about their comfort, not your credibility. And the justice you seek isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your professional identity and ensuring that future collaborations happen on terms that protect your interests as well as advance shared goals. You are not a supporting character in someone else's success story. You are the author of your own professional narrative, and it's time to take back the pen and write the next chapter on your own terms. Hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you, and turn on notifications because I've got more stories about workplace dynamics that nobody talks about, but everybody needs to hear. The professional world can be brutal, but it doesn't have to break you if you know what to watch for.